Okay, is my mic? Wow. Yes, my mic is on. That's quite loud. Okay. Looking for my, there we go. Excellent. It's a real pleasure being here. It's my first time in Australia. I've had the opportunity to spend a little bit of time up, I guess you call it North Country, up in Queensland, Cairns. Not the right time of year to come there, apparently. So I discovered that the hard way, but it's still a remarkable country, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to start by thanking Don Weatherburn and New South Wales Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research for inviting me to give this talk. I'd also like to thank my mentor, Mark Lipsey, because this talk is based on his large juvenile delinquency meta-analysis. He started working on that in around 1984. He's still not done. I think it might be getting to the point where this is reflecting a psychological problem, possibly. It's probably the meta-analysis that's been worked on longer than any other meta-analysis in the history of meta-analysis. But more importantly, the ideas that I'm going to present here reflect ideas that Mark and I have been sort of batting around and discussing off and on for longer than I'd care to admit. And I've never gotten around to putting them down on paper. And this is this conference, being invited here, sort of gave me an opportunity to really try to flesh out and push those ideas forward and test them out. And you guys are like the perfect group because it's a mix of policymakers, practitioners, and academics and academic researchers. And so it's sort of all the groups that I need to tell me how I've screwed up, right? So I'll leave plenty of time for a discussion where you can tell me why my ideas are wrong, but at least hopefully the ideas that I put out there will stimulate all of our thinking, and I do actually hope that the ideas, that you all find them useful in some way. I think I'm supposed to have a clicker here. Okay, right here. Here we go. Big green button. Now, the ideas that I'm going to talk about really emerged out of two basic insights. And these are not meant to be terribly profound, but they really just sort of serve as sort of my jumping off point. The first insight was that when we think about juvenile delinquency programs, with the exception of punitive programs, they're not actually targeting delinquency. Almost all juvenile delinquency programs, rehabilitation programs, treatment programs, et cetera, are focused on changing something else, something in the youth. Maybe their attitudes about something, maybe their skill set, changing their behavioral repertoire, social skills, knowledge about something, or possibly changing something in their immediate social environment, maybe enhancing family functioning, altering peer relationships, changing school environments, right? You can sort of start, you can see that we can sort of move out from the individual more broadly, that often these programs are not only trying to change something, but they're trying to increase something. They're trying to improve some aspect of the youth or his or her sort of immediate social, possibly physical world, but usually social world. And so, we don't round up a group of youth, bring them into a room and say, okay, I'm now going to teach you how not to commit crime. Right? I mean, it's just not engaging in a behavior. We're generally trying to bring about some other change. The other sort of insight that motivated this was the recognition that when we think about rehabilitation programs, there's a limitless number, an endless number of possible programs that could be created. Every person in this room could create a new juvenile delinquency treatment program, and then we need somebody to evaluate it. Well, not just one person. We need one person, then another person, and a few more people to evaluate it to figure out whether it works or not. And, and that just could keep on going, and at some level endless. And we might start chasing our tails. But if we think about these targets of the interventions, the things that we might want to change in the youth or his or her environment, et cetera, that's a much more limited set. Right? It's sort of a limited set of possible things that we might want to change. And I like to call these change levers, right? The levers that you're going to try to pull up or down. I know it's sort of mechanistic thinking in this modern computer age. It's probably not the right metaphor, but I guess I'm still very mechanistic. And so we think, the lever that you're trying to yank on to ultimately bring about change in delinquency. And it's a much more limited set. Still a large set, but much more limited. And so the goal is to think through, well, maybe if we focus on developing a knowledge base, an evidence base of which of these change levers are effective, that might be useful in moving forward our evidence-based work. And so this presentation, I'm going to try to present some data on that. Well, actually, using Mark Lipsey's meta-analysis as sort of a preliminary attempt. But to really explore a little bit more about some of the challenges with sort of this program focus. In preparing this talk, I went to crimesolutions.gov, the U.S. Department's Office of Justice Programs list of evidence-based programs. It's sort of the new incarnation of model programs. And I filtered to get programs focused on youth. And it identified 311 unique programs. It listed 62 of those as effective. I think, awesome, this is great, right? That we have 62 effective programs. But when you start peeling back the covers, you discover that most of these actually, the evidence base is pretty thin for most of them. Most of them have very few evaluations on them. And as someone who does meta-analysis, you do just a couple of meta-analysis and you suddenly realize that just 2 or 3 evaluations is not enough to establish that a program is really effective, because in doing a meta-analysis, you see how much results bounce from study to study. Those of you, many of you might be aware of the replicability crisis in the field of psychology right now. It's getting a lot of discussion and debate. And that's really highlighting that, it really is going to take several replications to sort of establish sort of a robust or durable knowledge about whether or not something's effective. And so, here's a little table that sort of breaks down the evidence base. Now, the methodology that crimesolutions.gov uses is they'll only examine more than 3 studies if they feel that that's needed. Now, we don't need to get into a criticism or debate on their methodology. It's not the point of my talk here. But where you see 3 studies, there might be more than 3 studies evaluating those programs. But the more important thing, if there are only 1 or 2 studies, that means that's all they've been able to identify. And so what we have here is each row is the number of programs that have been identified as effective, promising, or ineffective. We see 62. Did I say 64 earlier? I don't know. Hopefully that was not a mistake. There are 62 that have been identified as effective. 185 as promising, and 64 as ineffective. But what I want you to focus on is sort of that bottom row and the number of studies. And you can see that 234 of these 311 have only been evaluated by a single study. That's roughly 74%, if I recall my math correctly. And if we bump to the next category, how many of these programs have been evaluated at least twice? We're at 90%. So only 10% have 3 or more evaluations. Now, yes, in the effective category, not surprisingly, that's where studies have been evaluated more effectively, or at least not more effectively, but more often. But from my perspective, the evidence base is spread pretty thin here, right? And we don't have sort of the level of replication that we would like. But if you think, wow, that's 311 programs, that's still a lot of evaluation research that has been done. to assess these programs. But it's been spread across a lot of programs. That's not real efficient, and gosh, I think people are going to keep creating more programs, right? That's going to be one of the challenges here. So one of the challenges of sort of this branded program or sort of a distinct program type is that there are generally few evaluations of any specific program. There are a few exceptions. MST has had 20 to 30 evaluations of it, and there are a few that really have sort of robust literatures. But another challenge with sort of your branded programs is that a very common experience is that, some of the initial studies that are done under more tightly controlled situations establish that, yes, this program works, or at least this program can work, right? That it can work when done well. And so we get very excited about this, and we roll it out into the field more broadly and do evaluations out there, and the results are very disappointing. It fails to show effectiveness. And the typical argument that's made in the studies and in the literature is this reflects implementation failure, right? That as you move from the lab to the field, the program's just not being implemented as well. That's probably true. It's hard to know for sure. But one of the other things that often happens, at least in my discussions with practitioners as well, is when you move things into the field, there are constraints of agencies, constraints of working environments, and different sort of tastes and preferences of those on the front line who are implementing these programs, and so they often sort of tweak the program or adapt the program to their local conditions. And program developers really don't like this, right? And in a sense, it is risky when you sort of make these adaptations, modifications at the local level. But I also think that it's unrealistic to expect these kinds of programs, these complex social interventions, to be implemented without some local adaptation, right? That I think the constraints, just the nature of different organizations, different contexts, some adaptation is just going to occur. And with sort of the strong branded program black box evaluation, any modification is risky because you don't know what you can change safely and what you can't. But I think that if we have a stronger knowledge base and evidence base regarding change mechanisms, that can be helpful. And I'm going to flesh out those ideas as we go along. So in a sense, I sort of conceptualize things on this. It's not exactly a continuum, but if we want to think about sort of frameworks for thinking about effective programs, on the far, a little dyslexic, so left and right, far left, we have branded programs, right? And so branded programs are things that have a clear manual, have a name. You often have to sort of either pay to get trained or pay to license them. Examples might include MST, or here in Australia, Triple P. And there's a whole sort of list of these programs. Some might be free, but they at least have a manual, highly structured. And then you might also have something that I'm calling sort of generic programs. An example might be juvenile drug courts. Juvenile drug courts have sort of a clear program model. I was part of a research team that updated the guideline, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Programs guidelines in the U.S. for how these should be structured. So there's sort of a clear set of guidelines about how to structure a juvenile drug court, what the components should be. But each juvenile drug court is going to be a little bit different. It's not a brand. You don't have to pay. So generic programs would be of this nature, where there's a clear sort of set of guidelines, a framework for that program. They're identifiable as sort of unique, but it's not a single creator or a single brand. And so there would be a little more variation from location to location. And both of these evaluations tend to be black box, right? You're just sort of evaluating this package, ideally within a randomized controlled trial, a true experiment, seeing whether or not it produces a change on delinquency. But we can also adopt, and if you look in the literature, a framework for thinking about effectiveness that focuses on sort of generic treatment principles and practices. So rather than thinking about programs as a complete package, this is focused more on treatment principles, such as drawing on, say, cognitive behavioral techniques, or could also be principles such as selecting high-risk youth into the program, sort of part of the R&R model, the level of training for people, particular therapeutic techniques, et cetera. And so that's sort of the looking sort of now at the components of programs. But another framework, the one we're going to sort of explore today in my talk, is sort of focusing on change levers. So rather than thinking about programs in terms of what the programs are doing, what their activities are, let's look at them through the lens of what their proximal outcomes are. These change levers, the things that they're trying to improve in the youth and their environments. And thinking through which ones of those are effective in bringing about the ultimate change in delinquency and creating that focus. And so that's sort of where we're going here today. Let's see. So this is a little bit more actually about that third box, the treatment principles and practices. And some examples of that work that fits that sort of third box includes sort of the risk needs responsivity model of Andrews and Bonta and colleagues, which many of you are, I'm sure, familiar with. And it focuses on things like using evidence-based programs like cognitive behavioral, using high risk, focusing on high risk offenders, adapting the program to the learning modes of the individuals, et cetera. My mentor, Mark Lipsey, he's developed for juvenile delinquency programs this standardized program evaluation protocol tool, which essentially focuses on a fairly small list of characteristics that a program can evaluate themselves against, and whether if they fit those characteristics, if they're using those characteristics in terms of things like the training, using sort of people with backgrounds in mental health, social welfare, that sort of thing, appropriate training, et cetera, that you're likely to be implementing a program that would be beneficial. But what I would argue, and actually I'm going to sort of back up here a second, that if you combine these two on the right, that's starting to get inside the box. And the two together are actually a more powerful combination than either one by themselves, because they tell you the two things. What activities should you be doing, and what should you be focusing those activities on? So you might be using in your treatment program therapeutic techniques that bring about meaningful change. But it's not going to bring about meaningful change on the things that are going to lead to change in delinquency. Right? And so if we want to be so by combining empirical evidence on what activities, therapeutic practices we should be engaged in, with knowledge about what are the things that we should be targeting with our youth in terms of improving their lives, improving their developmental trajectories, et cetera, will then achieve the goal that we want of reduced delinquency. So let's see. So the bottom point here is that essentially this change lever framework, many of you are probably saying, well, you're just talking about mediational analysis. Yes, that's what I'm talking about, is mediational analysis, mediational effects. So we're examining the effect, the effectiveness in terms of delinquency by examining some intermediate or mediational effect. But keep in mind that we're not just interested in whether or not some mediator correlates with the outcome. Right? Ultimately, what's critical here is to recognize that the treatment needs to bring about change on this change lever or mediator or proximal outcome, and that it's that change in that proximal outcome that's bringing about the improvement in delinquency. So we can visualize this as sort of a classic mediational model. And you know, a black box model might evaluate whether a treatment program brings about change in delinquency. So you're focusing on path C there, right? Whether there's a causal effect between the treatment program and some reduction in delinquency. Once we move to sort of a mediational model, we would have our change lever, some proximal outcome that we would focus on, and we would try to examine whether the treatment program brings about change in that change lever, and that change in the change lever then also explains change in delinquency. And for something to be truly sort of an effective change lever, that A-B path needs to account for some meaningful portion of the C path. Now, delinquency is complex. So it's unlikely that we're ever going to find sort of some single mediator that sort of completely explains why some treatment program brings about change in delinquency. But different programs might work through different mechanisms, and for something to be meaningful, it needs to at least sort of account for some meaningful chunk of that change. But keep in mind that we're not talking about just explaining delinquency. We're talking about explaining change in delinquency, right? Reduction in delinquency with change in the change lever. Okay. So if we now move to thinking about the methods of some data that I'm going to present here, this is the results that I'm going to present. We shouldn't view these as sort of definitive, but as sort of a first step. It's going to take additional work, hopefully some of my own, but maybe some of yours as well, to really sort of try to start building up an evidence base in this direction. But this is to hopefully stimulate your thinking on this direction and give us some preliminary ideas. And to do this analysis, I used Mark Lipsey's large meta-analysis of juvenile delinquency programs. He currently has over 500 independent studies coded in that represent 361 primary reports. Now, the interesting thing, and many of you might be familiar with publications based on this, and they all focus on delinquency outcomes. Yeah, that's great, but he's also coded lots and lots of non-delinquency outcomes. But he hasn't actually done publications on those yet, and this is an analysis that makes use of those. And let's see here. Yeah, so he coded both delinquency and non-delinquency programs. And what I'm going to do is do an analysis that tries to look at whether a program's ability to change one of these non-delinquency outcomes is related to its ability to change delinquency. And I'm going to completely ignore the characteristics of the program. Right? I don't care what kind of a program it is. Right? So this is a whole, most of the analyses on this data set have been focusing about what type of treatment program, what are the characteristics of the program, what are the characteristics of the youth. Nope, I'm completely throwing that aside. I'm just saying, let's think about what changes, proximal, immediate changes the program's bringing about, and whether or not that can predict delinquency. Sort of a different way of framing this. So a little bit, I'm going to try to avoid spending too much time on this. It's available out in the literature or from me if you would like. But the study eligibility, essentially all of the studies, they had to be English speaking because unfortunately Mark's research team was limited to people who spoke English. The interventions were fairly broad net for thinking about interventions. Any intervention that was intended to reduce delinquency was eligible for this meta-analysis. The youth had to be juveniles. For most of the studies, it's youth between 12 and 18, though it was allowed to have samples that had a mix of kids up through 21. And these youth had to either be delinquent, so adjudicated within the juvenile justice system, or exhibiting clear antisocial behavior. So none of these programs are preventative. These are all intended to be programs for youth who are exhibiting delinquent type behaviors. And to be in the meta-analysis, there had to be sort of a delinquency type outcome measure, so an effect size, that could be coded for delinquency. But there were also lots of other outcomes that these studies report, and those were coded as well. Now, for the purpose of this talk, though, I am restricted to the subset of studies where these other outcomes were coded, which is not all of them. So we focus on the effect size. It's the standardized mean difference effect size. And everything's coded so that positive values are better. Now, this might be a little counterintuitive because delinquency, we've got it so that positive effect sizes actually mean less delinquency, but it's somehow easier just to think positive is good, negative is bad, and so everything's scaled so that positive is good. And for the non-delinquency outcomes, the goal was to try to pick the first sort of post-treatment. A lot of those outcomes are sort of a point-in-time outcome, and so a lot of them are measured right at the end of treatment. The delinquency outcomes, those often reflect sort of behavior over some period of time. Ideally, we tried to select the delinquency measure that was closest to sort of a 6-month time point post-treatment, though it varies across studies. But that was at least the goal. The non-delinquency outcomes were categorized in 45 different measurement constructs. We're only going to be using a subset of those where there's enough data. So the analyses, for those who care about these sorts of things, I do, by the way. I really care about this sort of thing. If you give me another half hour, we could geek out on all the methods behind this. It would be lovely. Do I have another half hour? No. So we used random effects regression to explore this relationship between non-delinquency and delinquency. So we're using the delinquency effect size as the dependent variable, and the non-delinquency effect size as the independent variable. So we're seeing whether or not change on the non-delinquency effect size predicts change on the delinquency effect size. And so the regression coefficients that I'm going to be presenting, because both of these are effect sizes, can be thought of as sort of the proportion improvement in delinquency relative to improvement in non-delinquency. And we'll explore that a little more as we get into actual examples, which here is an example. Now, I think we're going to look at 19 constructs where I had at least 20 studies that provided data, but I'm not going to show you 19 of these scatter plots. We don't have enough time, but I will show you the data. But I'm going to show you 2 scatter plots so that you can sort of visualize what's going on, and then I'll just give you the data. But I think it's helpful to make sure that we really understand what's going on. So this is the scatter plot for change in family functioning, and whether or not change in family functioning then is predictive of change in delinquency. And the good news here is we see a nice positive relationship, a slope of 0.61. So each dot here is a different study. And the x-axis is family functioning. The y-axis is delinquency. So if we first focus on the upper right quadrant, right, those are studies where there was improvement in family functioning and also improvement in delinquency. So that's sort of what we want to see, right? We'd like to see studies up there. Matter of fact, I guess there's there's a study way up here that really saw a lot of improvement in both. Other studies where there was a lot of improvement in family functioning and only a moderate amount of improvement in delinquency. But having a cluster of studies up here suggests that improving whatever variable we're exploring down here, which is family functioning in this case, suggests change in delinquency. And at 0.61, we can interpret that however big the effect is on family functioning, we would predict an effect on delinquency that is basically 61% of that same size, right? So which is sort of a nice sort of way to sort of think about it. Now, studies down here in this bottom left quadrant, that's studies where they observed a decrease in family functioning and also observed a decrease in delinquency. That also further adds evidence to family functioning being an effective change lever. Now, this upper left quadrant, that's where we actually saw a decrease in family functioning but an increase in delinquency. And those are studies where you would think that there's evidence that there's a different change mechanism going on, right? A different change lever is at work in those studies, right? Yeah, and if you have a lot of studies down here, that would be suggestive that whatever change lever this is, it's probably not a good one to be targeting. And we see very few for family functioning. So what does this say about family functioning? Probably a good change lever, right? Or at least this is preliminary evidence in that direction. The next one. This is one where we don't see a clear pattern of evidence suggesting that this is a useful change lever. And so what's the change lever? It's employment-related outcomes. These mostly things about sort of getting or keeping a job. So helping youth, and keep in mind these are youth, right? For adults, this might be completely different. But for youth, helping them get a job, helping them keep a job, doesn't seem to be related to delinquency. Now keep in mind that we're not talking about is it useful to help youth get a job. We're talking about making a change in their ability, right? And so, what we see is that there are some programs, right here, for example, that were very effective at helping youth get and keep jobs, right? So it's not that these programs were ineffective. These programs were effective. They were very good at helping youth get and keep jobs. But that had no relationship to any change in their delinquency, right? And then we have some programs down here, and so you've got a mix of programs. And so now, yes, you would say, well, there's a little bit of a relationship. It's not statistically significant. We've got evidence down here where some programs that had a small improvement in their employment sort of outcomes actually saw worsening in their delinquency. So in this framework that I'm putting forward, this would sort of suggest that it's not, for youth, employment's probably not a useful change lever. Okay, so let's look at a lot more outcomes. So I've got 2 pages of this. And so we've got a category of psychological adjustment, behavior problems, and they're sort of sorted from high to low within each category. Behavior problems, this is actually the strongest effect we see, but many of you might be thinking, well, behavioral problems is at some level just another form of delinquency, so not surprising here in that sense. But we see some moderate effects for attitudes regarding delinquency, personality, et cetera. Interpersonal adjustment, this is where we see some big effects. The family functioning that you just saw, attitudes about interpersonal issues. And this one's rather shocking, peer relations. I would expect that one to be a lot larger. I need to dig into the primary studies and really figure out what those measures were measuring. At the moment, I can't tell you that. But what we see here, just, these are the regression coefficients. So the bigger the number, the stronger the relationship between changing this variable and change in delinquency. We've got the confidence interval and then the number of studies. Right? So we've got the number of studies that contributed to that analysis. And so we see here, all of these are significant except for peer relations as potential mediators. School adjustment. This one is actually, I find, quite interesting. We see that dropping out of school and school attendance tardiness, we see nice relationships there, suggesting that programs that help keep kids in school are also programs that are effective at reducing delinquency. But it's sort of a, but academic achievement, both of these are non-significant and smaller, particularly school grades. This would suggest that as change lever, it's a lot more important to just keep kids in school than if our focus is delinquency, right? Than necessarily improving their school functioning. And this bottom one is sort of the employment that we already saw, and attitudes towards work. Yeah, doesn't seem to be an effective change lever, right? So you might come up with a really effective program that's really good at improving their attitudes towards work, but don't expect that to improve delinquency. Okay. So this is now just summarizing what we were looking at. The change levers with the largest effects on delinquency, behavioral problems, family functioning, dropping out of school, attitudes regarding delinquency, and attitudes about interpersonal relationships. And some of the smallest, peer relations, which, as I said, that one's suspicious to me, and we're going to have to explore it more. School achievement, school grades, and vocational work-related stuff. Now, as I was playing around with this, I then thought, well, how well does this map onto what programs are effective and what aren't? And so I went to the blueprints, Blueprints for Violence. They're sort of model programs because it had pretty good information. One, they're really rigorous about sort of what makes it into their model plus sort of effective programs. And they had information on what outcomes the programs are effective at changing, right? And so that sort of helped me sort of map some of these outcomes onto what's in the blueprints. And Blueprints identifies 8 model programs that have impacts on delinquency. Right? So if I then look at sort of what those programs are focusing on as sort of their proximal outcomes, 5 of those 8 are focusing on family functioning. That's consistent with sort of what my data is suggesting. 2 were focusing on social emotional learning, and 1 was focusing on life skills training, which is not really reflected in my data in any meaningful way. And so this is fairly consistent with this change levers analysis, that the programs that are focusing on these levers that seem to be the more effective levers are the programs that are tending to bubble up as the most promising. Okay, I see that I was hoping to end at about this point to give plenty of room for conversation, but I still have some comments sort of in terms of pulling this all together and what does it mean and where should we go from here. So if we think about what's the utility of this change lever framework as opposed to sort of a model program framework. And I'm not trying to, I'm a co-editor of the Journal of Experimental Criminology. So I am a strong supporter of just straight up randomized controlled trials. I mean, we need those. We need lots of those, right? But I think that this framework that I'm putting forward is something to augment that, to enhance that, and hopefully help push us forward. So, and I think there are 3 main benefits. One, I think it facilitates theory development relative to juvenile justice program by helping us identify the potential causal pathways by which the programs are effective. Right? It helps us start to get inside those black box, the black box of our programming. I also think it helps with implementation of programs. Right? So when I started out talking about branded programs, one of the challenges of brand name programs is rolling them out into the real world. And maintaining that fidelity. Well, if we know and sort of have an evidence-based for what sort of immediate outcomes we're trying to bring about in the youth, I think that helps focus the activities of frontline providers so that they know, and have a clear idea of what they're trying to bring about. So rather than just knowing these are the activities that I'm supposed to do, and somehow that's supposed to change delinquency, they also know that this is what I'm trying to bring about in terms of immediate changes in the youth I'm working with. And I think that that would facilitate any local adaptations, that it helps you know that, well, whatever we change, we have to at least keep our eye on the ball, right? You know what ball it is you're trying to keep the eye on. I also think another third use, and I actually, when I was talking to some colleagues didn't like this one, but I think that it can help us be a little more efficient in our evaluation research, in the randomized controlled trials, in that it might help us to say, if we have a strong evidence base on sorting through effective change levers and ineffective change levers, and one of you, unfortunately, comes to me with some brand new program that you think is great, and I ask you, what are the change levers that you're focusing on? And you tell me that you're going to improve their work skills. I might say, well, I'm not really going to waste the energy evaluating it. Now, some people say, yeah, but it might, we should evaluate everything because everything might work. Well, we only have so much resources, right? And there are only so many skilled evaluators. And I think that having a model of these, of both what are effective practices, treatment practices, and what are the effective change levers can help us sort through the potential of a program. Not necessarily be able to say, yes, this program will work and this one won't, but at least helps us sort through which ones are worth really devoting a lot of resource energy to and which ones might not be. If we think about sort of the contributions to program theory, when I sort of was thinking about, well, what are the elements of most program theories? Most program theories have basically sort of four elements. One, they have a set of activities that program is supposed to engage in, right? We could think of those as the active ingredients of a program. They also, most program theories sort of have sort of an expectation on those proximal outcomes or those change levers. And then most program theories also sort of have a prediction about the long-term effects, whether that be on delinquency or drug use or something else. And a good program theory would then also have some rationale that ties all of those things together. And I think that this sort of change lever model that I'm arguing for, that we augment our existing work with, I think will help contribute to sort of this kind of theorizing. And Kasdan, which any of you in psychology and clinical psychology, Alan Kasdan should know, is a big name in child clinical psychology. He's actually made some very similar arguments to the ones that I'm making here, that in terms of sort of psychotherapy programs for children, that if we have a much stronger knowledge base regarding causal mechanisms, that will facilitate not only theory development, but also implementation in real-world settings. Now, some of you, particularly those of you who are much more methodological and statistical, have probably been biting, or sitting on your hands wanting to say, but wait, you got a problem. And yeah, there is a clear methodological challenge with the way that I'm analyzing these data, and it's the ecological fallacy problem. Right? So with the data that I'm analyzing, I don't really know whether the youth whose family functioning improved are the same youth whose delinquency decreased. Now, we might logically think that they're probably the same youth, but the data don't actually tell us that, right? Because I'm using the aggregate level data at the study level. Now, can we know that? Yeah, with the primary level data. That really goes to then, one of the things that I think we need to do moving forward is we need to really do a lot more mediational analyses at the individual level. Every study that I used in these analyses could have done that mediational analysis. And I don't recall seeing any one that did. That's a real, in a sense, wasted opportunity in terms of contributions to our empirical research. So we need to better exploit, the data that we do have, the primary studies. I'm sure a lot of you who do program evaluations create these logic models, and your logic models have the intermediate outcomes, the long-term outcomes, and you measure all of those, and then you just analyze them all separately. Please start doing mediational analysis, right? To try to help contribute to that knowledge base, And straight up randomized controlled trials can also be doing these sorts of analyses and contributing to this knowledge base. The other sort of challenge here is that, delinquency is, well, that's not really what I'm clearly going to riff on this and add a new bullet point here. Delinquency is a very complex thing, and so there's likely to be lots of change levers. And I think that really does create a bit of a challenge here. It'd be nice if we worked in an area where we might be able to sort everything down to 4 change levers, right? Just focus on that. But it's likely to be a larger list, but it's being a much smaller list. It's not going to be 62 like on the 62 effective programs. I doubt we could come up with 62 effective change levers. And the fact that there are multiple change levers, and this is where I was going with this bullet point, does make it a little more difficult statistically to establish that a particular change lever is causal. And ultimately, that's what we want to know, that a change lever is not just sort of correlational, but it's really causal, that it's the treatment changing that lever is what's bringing about change in the delinquency. And when you have, if a particular program has multiple mechanisms through which it's working, it makes it more difficult to tease out whether something is truly causal. And that's just a statistical and methodological challenge with this kind of work. So what are the next steps? Well, first off, we do have more studies. Not all of the studies in the juvenile delinquency meta-analysis database were coded for these non-delinquency outcomes. He eventually stopped doing that in some of the newer studies that were added. So we can build up this database a little bit more. I also think it would be really interesting to expand this out to looking at this for prevention programs, for adult programs, because at some level, these change levers might be fairly general. They might not be so highly contextualized as other things. That change levers that work for juveniles might work for kids who are not yet juveniles, right? And it might be some of the same levers that work for youth and adult, though some might be different. For example, the work would be a classic example, that might behave very differently for young adults than for youth. But I think that we could build up and start exploring this across different types of programs. Again, I've already made this point, but we really need to start doing this with individual level data so that we can have a much stronger causal inference. And I think that's it. Thank you very much.
I'm sure there are questions. Who has one? They're always shy. Look at this, up back there. Richard.
Just thinking about your peer findings.
Yeah.
Won't the direction and strength of the effect depend on whether the peers are pro-social or anti-social?
Well, yeah, and that's where I need to really dig into the studies to see what they were measuring. And I think that's one of the obvious possibilities is that, bringing about change in peer relations just in and of itself might not be, what might really matter is what kind of a change you're bringing about. And if I understand your point, that's what you're getting at? Yeah, I think you're probably dead on that one.
Yep.
You might have touched on this a little bit in the last dot point that you sort of elaborated on.
Yeah.
But is there a way, or can you think of a way of understanding one
I'm not entirely sure I'm getting this, but are you asking whether programs might, the combination of change levers that they're focusing on?
Well, look at the school one, for example.
Right.
So school attendance,
Right.
regardless of grade improvement, say.
Right.
Just using the example you just said.
Right.
Is it because school attendance programs designed to encourage kids to go to school are delivered alongside other programs that are often delivered alongside other programs that have a delinquency effect? And so it's actually showing a relationship or not a relationship that's actually about something not within the program or even that sort of grouping of change levels. Is there a way you can
I think with my data, not. But I think that that's sort of an interesting way to go. Because, you know, in a sense, what I decided to do was completely ignore what the program was doing, right? And some of you are going, well, maybe we want to know what they're doing, right? And in a sense, it would be interesting to know the degree to which the programs were actually intentionally trying to change some of these variables. Now, the fact that they, you know, I am at some level making an assumption that if they measured, studies that measured these outcomes presumably measured them because they thought that they would be bringing about change. Yeah, but I'm not sure I've completely answered your question, but maybe, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh.
I had a question about how you did it. So you have, I think it was like 38 programs or 64 or whatever that goes into the regression. Do each of them receive an equal weight? So some programs have more people in the
Yeah.
more observations. They get a higher weight, or are they counted as equal, or how does it work?
No, you'll see, and actually I did sort of skip over this. You see the, that
Oh,
some,
the dot
some of
sizes.
the dot sizes?
Right,
Yeah, the bigger
okay.
the dot size, the greater the weight. And so it's, and I think I skipped over how many studies, but there was like 276 that ultimately contributed across these, but there were 37 in this analysis. But yeah, these are all inverse variance weighted. So, you know, which is roughly correlated to sample size. So studies with larger sample sizes get more weight than studies with smaller sample sizes.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So even if we could correctly associate delinquency behavior and these change levels at the individual level, how do we know that the program worked if there's no randomization in the first place? Am I missing something here?
No,
These programs are
yeah,
randomized.
my argument would be we want randomization in the first place, right? Because you sorry, I'm going to keep flipping all the way back to, these are great questions, by the way. To this, you know, we want to know that A is causal. And the only way to know that A is causal is if you've got random assignment. Well, it's not the only way, but it's the most straightforward way, right? There are, you know, other ways to sort of try to infer causation, but it's the most straightforward way to know that A is causal. If A is just correlational, that might be informative, but it's not really what we want to know. You're right. What we want to know is that it's causal. And so ultimately, you would want to embed this in a randomized controlled trial or high-quality quasi-experimental design with really credible sort of design. Yeah. Okay. Good.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I wonder how easy or difficult it is to do the same sort of change lever analysis for population level intervention.
You mean where you don't have individual level data, where you only have aggregate level?
Or not a program targeting at a specific group, but more at a population level intervention.
Oh. I haven't thought about that. That's a really tough question. So the intervention's targeting sort of at the population level. And
so I guess my example is the mandatory bicycle helmet law.
Okay.
That was in place to reduce head injuries.
right.
But it sort of do so by changing people's behavior in wearing helmets. So
Correct.
I guess
Correct.
the change lever is that more people start to wear a helmet.
Correct. Correct.
And as a consequence, we would expect less head injury.
Right. And so, yeah, I do think you can still do that at that level. You know, in that you've got a clear sort of you know, causal change. And so you're going to want to see whether or not that's connected. You can't quite do the kind of, mediational analysis that really gives you all these estimates. But you can still do an analysis that's informative, right, in that, or at least diagnostic. That, for example, if the program is not effective, and you explore whether or not the program did in fact change people's helmet wearing behavior, and you discover that it didn't, well, you've got, that's then sort of suggestive that, well, maybe that's why. Or, if you do establish that you had both of those outcomes, people's helmet wearing behavior changed, and that there were fewer head injuries, that your change model is consistent with the data. But you wouldn't be able to actually estimate it statistically. So you could do it sort of conceptually, but not statistically with that kind of data. Absolutely.
Yep.
Did you find an age effect?
Well, yeah, most of the data is 12 to 18. There's only a few studies that have a subsample of youth that are 18 to 21. And in these analyses, I didn't explore that. But I also, with the exception of something like employment, I wouldn't expect there to really be much of an age effect when you're at the level of these change levers. Now, in a sense, ultimately it's an empirical question whether my guess is correct. But I think that at the level of these change levers, that they're going to be less sensitive to moderator effects, to things like age or race or sex or geographic context or even a country. Some of them may, but when you think about sort of family functioning, I think that would probably be just as true in Australia as it would be in the US, as it would be in the Netherlands, for example, right? And I think that's one of the advantages of this. But no, I've not looked at it here. Keep in mind, because it's study level data, the best I can do is sort of look at the average age of the sample. And that's pretty crude sort of way of looking at it. You'd really want to explore that with primary data. Thank you.
Gentleman with the microphone.
Did many of the studies have multiple? Sorry. Did many of the studies have multiple change levers recorded, and did that help you sort of untangle some of the interactions between them?
Many of them did, yes, and I haven't explored that. And that would be interesting to look at, the combinations of these and whether or not they overlap in that way. I think that would be a nice future direction. So thank you for that, but I haven't looked at that now.
Oh, yes.
Any observation of gender difference in the change levers?
No, and with this data set, we have tried to look at differential treatment effects by gender. And there's the majority of these programs are male samples. There's, I think, in the full data set, not the subset I'm dealing with here, I think there might be about 48 that are focused just on girls, and then some that have a mix of boys and girls. It's also surprising that some studies don't tell you whether it's all boys, all girls, or what. Often those are all boys, but we don't know. But the analyses that we have done have shown that have just focused on gender effects by treatment type, not by change lever. Have not identified differential effects, that some programs are more effective for girls, some more effective for boys. The only pattern we find is that overall programs tend to be more effective for girls than boys. In other words, girls just tend to have slightly better outcomes. But we've been unable to find any sort of interaction effects where that would suggest differential programming for girls than boys in this data. So,
Got time for a couple more questions, if there are any. Yeah, right up the back.
Okay, so my understanding is that there is correlation between family functioning and delinquency in terms of change effect or change lever effect. So my question is there sort of further analysis on family functioning, like different variables that would influence it even more? So for instance, like family cohesion or domestic violence or family time, just like examples.
Yes, and in a sense, I think, trying trying to remember how many studies we had contributing to that one. Whoops, back up one. So there are 37 studies. And yeah, it would be possible, and that's sort of one of the things I want to explore is, this was any sort of measure of family functioning. And some of those might reflect some of these different constructs that you're talking about. And those could be analyzed separately, but as you start chopping things up, you very quickly get to where you don't have really enough studies for a meaningful full sort of analysis. Yeah.
Okay, one last.
What do you hypothesize the reason why the sort of employment engagement pathway or lever wasn't selected? Because I guess in terms of some of other work that's been done in that space, that's a different stuff. So why do you think?
Yeah, I mean, well, and I'm not sure that my, take on this is going to be any more valid than all of yours. I think that for youth, focusing on employment at some level is saying, yeah, we don't think, schooling is for you. And it may be then, reinforcing peer connections with other deviant peers who within that sort of workspace. That's just a wild guess on my part, and maybe you could share your thoughts on that if you have some, because I'm not entirely sure.
Okay, so we've run out of time.
Thank you.
Could you just join me in thanking David Wilson? It's still a token of our appreciation.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. We now have morning tea, so we'll take a break and then we'll split into the separate sections.
Great.
Thank you so much. I
Absolutely.
really appreciate it. It's great.
Good.
Thank you.